Good evening and welcome to Poland Daily. My name is Natalia Moczulska and this is the news. The Russian army fired on the so-called filter camp in Oleniwka on the territory of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. There were Ukrainian prisoners of war from Azovstal in the camp. As reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the Kremlin is trying to accuse the authorities in Kiev of this crime. The Russian media distributes recordings from the bombed penal colony in Oleniwka, where the Russians held prisoners from the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. The Russians accuse the Ukrainian side of the attack. According to the Kremlin, it was to be carried out using the American HIMARS missiles. However, the false accusations of Russian propaganda were refuted by the Ukrainian side. As reported by the Chancellery of President Volodymyr Zelensky, each use of HIMARS missiles is accurately recorded, and the attack on the penal colony in Oleniwka is provocative. A few days ago, the Russians moved some of the prisoners to a barrack, which was destroyed in the explosion. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army has been successfully continuing its attacks on Russian ammunition and weapons depots located behind the front lines. The Ukrainian Air Force attacked warehouses of Russian ammunition in the occupied territories 7 times. 4 warehouses in the area of Genichesk, Cherson, Nowa Kachowka, and Berysław were destroyed. Russian troops once again fired on one of the districts of Mykolaiv with the use of cluster missiles prohibited by international law. Due to the successive actions of the Ukrainian armed forces in the south, the Russians changed their tactics. Yesterday, during the curfew, they fired on a residential area of the city, destroying many buildings. There were no military facilities or other such purposes there. Today, they fired on another district, and missiles fell next to a public transport stop. 5 people are killed, 7 are injured. Please be careful. The city may be under fire at any time, and you are not allowed to bathe in the sea. 2 people died in Koblevo yesterday after a mine explosion. According to the U.S. War Research Institute, the Russian armed forces are preparing to attack Kharkiv again. On the other hand, the main goal of the present stage of the war in Donbass will most likely be the capture of Bakhmut. The Russians can therefore reduce the intensity of the attacks on Seversk. In the Donetsk region, as a result of the Russian shelling, at least 8 people were killed and 19 injured during the last 24 hours. Slovyansk was shot again. Many apartment blocks in the city center were damaged as a result of the missile attack. There are still difficulties in delivering humanitarian aid to frontline villages and territories occupied by the Russians.
Since the start of the war, the UN and our colleagues from the NGOs have not been able to send any relief supplies to areas beyond the control of the government of Ukraine. We have not been able to conduct any assessments on the impact of the war on humanitarian needs. In Zaporizhzhia Oblast, for example, we have a very recent example of the challenge that we are facing here in Ukraine. This week, the Russian Federation prevented us from crossing the front line to deliver assistance in Polohi. We were prepared, we had the supplies, and we could not go. We have to deliver the 50 tons of different humanitarian supplies to another area, a settlement in the government-controlled areas called Stepanitsky. While there, our team had to take shelter as shelling is starting the settlement. The shelling happened dangerously close to us, while our colleagues were trying to offload the trucks. Both sides to the conflict, they were notified of our movements.
Today, the ambassadors of the G7 countries visited Odessa to emphasize the importance of the agreements on the export of Ukrainian grain. The first ship is already loaded. This is to be the first grain shipment since the beginning of the war. As for the loaded ships that were prevented from leaving due to the ongoing war, they too will eventually be allowed to leave the port. Our soldiers guarantee their safe loading. We are in contact with Turkey and the United Nations. They are waiting for our signal. We trust that the process will be successful. For now, everyone keeps their commitments, but you know, people risk their lives because they don't know how the process will go. The first ship is to leave the port today. Jarosław Kaczyński, the president of Law and Justice, announced that after the presentation of the report on the losses suffered by Poland during World War II, further actions will be taken to obtain reparations from Germany. The document will be published on September 1st, on the anniversary of the armed attack on Poland. The president of Law and Justice explains that the issue of reparations from Germany for World War II cannot be abandoned and will be undertaken on many levels. I hope that the operation on war reparations from Germany should bring results, although I realize that it may take a whole generation. But you have to start sometime. You must not give it up. On Wednesday, Jarosław Kaczyński met with the head of the German CDU, Friedrich Merz. The issue of reparations was one of the main topics of the talks. As for reparations, he stated that at the moment, no German government would agree to it. I replied that history is dynamic and we will be raising this matter because it has a material dimension as well as a dignity dimension. Why would they not pay us if they paid 70 countries? On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany launched a barbaric invasion of Poland. German troops used methods of combat involving destruction, for example by destroying villages and Polish cities en masse, plundering cultural goods and exterminating the population. During the Warsaw Uprising, a decision was made to raise the city to the ground, and in one of the districts of Warsaw, Wola, the inhabitants were slaughtered. The list of reasons why Poles have the right to demand reparations is long. For terror, for crimes against the nation, for civilians, for looting, for using cheap labor, for concentration camps. According to various estimates, over 6 million citizens of the Second Polish Republic died during World War II, and over 5 million were repressed by the Germans. Poland suffered the greatest biological losses. For every 1,000 inhabitants, 220 died, and the greatest material losses. Since 2017, a special parliamentary team has been involved in estimating the amount of these losses. It is a very broad work, of course historical aspects, German occupation, part of the Soviet occupation. We must also remember about the massacre in Volhynia and the murders that took place in Lithuania. Exploitation of the Republic of Poland, consisting in the entire system of contributions, quotas, and robbery. All these matters will be described, presented, and we will try to evaluate them. The report is translated into several languages. The awareness of the Western world about the history of Poland during the Second World War is not only scarce, but often incorrect. For years, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has undertaken thousands of interventions due to the use of the term Polish extermination camps. The truth is that Poland did little to change the awareness of European countries about the situation of Poland during World War II, to change this awareness somehow. According to the journalist Jacek Liziniewicz, the report will certainly be noticed by the public in our western neighbor, in Germany. I think that this will be one of the main topics of fall and one of the main topics in Polish-German relations. One of the symbols of the destruction that the Germans made are fragments of the Saski Palace in Warsaw. In the first quarter of next year, a competition for architectural design will be announced. The palace was blown up by the Germans in December 1944 in revenge for the outbreak of the Warsaw Uprising. A telephone conversation between the presidents of the United States and China lasted more than 2 hours. The leaders discussed Taiwan and the attempt to change its status. This was the 5th such conversation between the two leaders. Its main topic was the status of Taiwan. The U.S. and Chinese leaders also discussed a number of other regional and global issues and recommended that their teams continue consultations.
The first was a detailed discussion of areas where the two countries can work together, with particular focus on climate change and health security and counter narcotics. The two teams will be following up on these areas. President Biden also raised the need to resolve the cases of American citizens who are wrongfully detained or subject to exit bans in China, as well as longstanding concerns about human rights. Second, they exchanged views on Russia's war in Ukraine and the global impacts it is having. And then on Taiwan, President Biden underscored that the United States policy has not changed and that the United States strongly opposes unilateral efforts to change the status quo or undermine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait.
Public opinion cannot be violated, and playing with fire will burn itself. I hope the U.S. side will see this point clearly. The U.S. side should be consistent in its words and deeds in adhering to the One China principle and fulfilling the 3 Sino-U.S. joint communiques. We are firmly opposed to the secession of Taiwan independence and interference by outside forces, and will never leave any room for any form of Taiwan independence forces. The position of the Chinese government and the Chinese people on the Taiwan issue has been consistent, and it is the firm will of more than 1.4 billion Chinese people to resolutely safeguard China's national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Xi Jinping stressed that to view and define China-U.S. relations from the perspective of strategic competition and to regard China as the most important opponent and the most serious long-term challenge is a misjudgment of China-U.S. relations and a misinterpretation of China's development and will mislead the two peoples and the international community. Earlier today, President Andrzej Duda spoke with President Xi Jinping. The conversation lasted an hour and largely dealt with the consequences of Russian aggression against Ukraine. However, Polish-Chinese economic relations were also discussed during the call. I am very pleased to have spoken with President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping. We talked about Ukraine and its territorial integrity. I spoke about the need to combat the Russian-induced food crisis, and we discussed Polish-Chinese relations, the development of which is an important point in Poland's policy. In a statement from the president's office, we read that Andrzej Duda presented to Xi Jinping the Polish position on the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The president of the People's Republic of China expressed readiness to cooperate with the Polish side in the search for ways to end the conflict peacefully. Both sides stressed the importance they give to respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, including Ukraine. President Duda drew attention to Russia's attempts to provoke a global food crisis and the possibility of an active role for China in alleviating it. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please stay tuned for Poland Daily Weather, Poland Daily Business, and some of our other programs. But from me, it's have a great weekend.